Hello, everyone. This is Chadi Alraies from Detroit Medical Center. We're really privileged today to have Dr. Joaquin Cigarroa, who is Deputy Editor of CCI. Also, he is Division Head of Cardiology at Melvin Judkins Professor of Medicine, OHSU. Dr. Cigarroa, thanks for being with us.
I'm so excited to be here with you and your team to talk about this remarkable moment in history. And we at CCI are happy to recognize and celebrate the 20th anniversary of the first successfully implanted TAVR by Dr. Alain Crebier in 2002, which was performed in a 57-year-old man with calcific aortic stenosis, cardiogenic shock, subacute leg ischemia, and other associated non-cardiac diseases, performed via transseptal approach. The procedure was successful. This moment in 2002 reflected a substantial amount of work, which initially started with surgical aortic valve commissurotomy, then percutaneous balloon valvuloplasty, which were both initially successful, but complicated by restenosis, stroke, aortic insufficiency, and vascular complications. With these identified unmet patient needs, clinician investigators working in concert with biomedical engineers and industry partners developed the concept of the aortic valve mounted in a stent, which could be deployed in the aortic valve. Initially, this was performed in cadavers and sheep, and then in 2002, as we just discussed, successfully performed in a human subject. Following this, it was a remarkable collaboration which ensued with the FDA, industry, and clinical investigators, which led to the first TAVR valve approved for use in extreme risk patients, now via a retrograde approach. As a result of this remarkable collaboration, several additional innovations have occurred, which has accelerated the adoption and success of this technique and broadened the indications to now include low, intermediate, and high-risk patients. These innovations have led to an agreement to have national coverage decision regarding the procedure, not only with the initial IFU, but with the subsequent broadening of the indications, which means that patients all across the United States could have access to the procedure. Second, the requirement to develop a heart team approach to promote shared decision-making amongst cardiologists, surgeons, and imaging specialists was emphasized and shared and has resulted in improved shared decision-making, not only amongst the clinicians, but also between the clinicians and our patients. Third, this collaboration led to the formation of the TVT registry, which has provided invaluable insights into the successful transition from clinical trials to a greater adoption amongst patients with aortic stenosis in the United States. This, as well, has provided further insights into the procedural success and complications, which have resulted in enhanced iterative design to valves and the delivery systems to improve the procedural success, the number of patients that can be treated with the devices, and improve long-term outcomes, which has resulted in reductions in stroke, paravalvular leak, and the need for permanent pacemaker implants. In addition, it has been demonstrated to have remarkable short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes comparable to surgically implanted valves. The TVT registry most recently has demonstrated now over 70,000 valves implanted with a TAVR technique in the United States alone. Fourth, we have learned how to successfully train existing interventional cardiologists to add into their armamentarium the approach to structural transcatheter aortic valve replacement, which has improved geographic reach to patients across this country. And finally, it has resulted in the acceleration of percutaneous approaches for treating mitral and tricuspid valves. CCI continues to play a substantial role in publishing research articles and case reports, which enhance the knowledge regarding not only aortic valve disease, but the current and future treatments for aortic valve disease, including transcatheter aortic valve replacement?
Thank you very much. I think you've really nicely taken us through the history of TAVR over the past 20 years. As we move forward towards implanting these valves in younger and lower risk patients, what do you see as the challenges for us as interventional cardiologists?
So that's a great question. And as we have moved from extreme to low risk and to patients who are much younger, there are a couple of fundamental questions that one must discuss with our patients. The first is a durability, and that is the implantation of a bioprosthetic valve on a stent frame. And I think that in part we have learned that the bioprosthetic valve performance hemodynamically, and recently this past year, the durability over the intermediate to long term certainly appears to perform favorably with bioprosthetic valves. How it performs relative to mechanical aortic valves in young patients, let's say, a 50 or 52-year-old individual, more often bicuspid, I think remains a question, and the shared decision-making of step approaches with the initial treatment, the success, the probability of exiting the procedure without a stroke or a pacemaker, I think is really important. Making sure that we discuss with the patient the probability of valve in the future, or the need to explant a valve on a stent frame and what that operation might look like, I think are important discussions to have with those younger patients.
What did we learn from the process of developing TAVR, from the failures, the rejections, to the first trial, first in human? We cardiologists, we evolved to where we are now. We don't appreciate what happened in the past. And
Sure.
how we repeat this again in another space that's related to cardiovascular?
There are several learnings. One, the need to co-locate the perspectives and the knowledge base of biomedical engineers, cardiologists, imagers, and cardiothoracic surgeons, because we have been taught differently, we have read different literature, and how we look at imaging and how we directly look at valves has led to several important observations. One, the design testing is essential, and working with our industry partners and the Food and Drug Administration is essential so that we can successfully design the next clinical trials to ask the question. Two, the importance of the early animal studies really demonstrated that the need for calcium to anchor the valves, whether they were stented, self-expandable, or balloon expandable, were really essential to the first and second generations of these devices. And so the importance of calcification to ensure that the positioning that one initially attained would remain is critically important. The third is how one translates the knowledge of the clinical trial into the general population of proceduralists and patients really has demonstrated the invaluable nature of registries and how information from the registries are shared with FDA, with investigators, and then to look at that individual unit of that hospital to say, are we attaining the same results and or better results, and what have we noticed, have all been remarkable. And I think those lessons are being applied to transcatheter approaches to the mitral and tricuspid space.
Next item, Dr. Cigarroa would like to highlight a couple of articles published at CCI related to the TAVR development and challenges.
Chadi, thank you so much. There are two articles that I would like to briefly highlight. And the first really follows the question that you just asked, what have we learned? And We have learned that the patient access is not necessarily universal for all patients with aortic stenosis. And an article by Young and colleagues was published earlier this month in CCI entitled Temporal Trends in Transcatheter Aortic Valve Replacement Use and Outcomes by Race, Ethnicity, and Sex. And what is apparent when one utilizes a national inpatient sample of hospitals, that the greatest uptake in the utilization of this procedure and technology has been primarily applied to white men and women, and that the uptake amongst Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, independent of whether they're a man or a woman, remains lagging. And the associated patient comorbidities and complications are also different. Insurance status is different. And this is on a background of other literature, which has demonstrated that the vast majority of operators in TAVR procedures are primarily men, very few women. Less than 2% of the operators, for example, are interventional women. And so this manuscript, along with many others, demonstrates that disparities remain. And it doesn't tell us the why, but it clearly tells us that we as a society of interventional cardiologists and cardiothoracic surgeons really need to spend a substantial amount of time and effort to understand why these disparities exist. And concomitant with that, we need to attract more women and underrepresented minorities to become interventional cardiologists. And we need to understand how insurance status impacts access. And so I think there has been progress which has been made, but we have a tremendous amount of work to better understand how to improve access for all Americans with aortic stenosis.
Yeah, I think it's a very important paper, and I think it very nicely highlights the disparities in care. We're becoming increasingly aware of disparities in care in all areas of medicine, and I think it's something as interventional cardiologists we need to take into consideration. Obviously, within the US healthcare systems, there's the issues with insurance and access to care via various insurance pathways. With regard to training and retaining interventional cardiologists, I think obviously there's an increasing awareness of the underrepresentation of women, of ethnic minorities within interventional cardiology, and certainly there's a lot of work being done by SCI and all the interventional groups to recruit a more diverse workforce. Certainly it's a key paper, and I think it highlights to us all the importance of considering all of the patient population.
Thank you so much. I absolutely agree with you. And I must admit, early on in my career, despite myself being an underrepresented minority, I thought that, I cared for all patients equally and would say, well, every patient that gets referred for a cath, we treat the same way, independent of sex, independent of insurance status, when they reached, our lab. And then I heard that same refrain on, well, we did everything we could on door to balloon time for patients being transferred. And so once they got to me, I did everything we could. Now, clearly, we cannot simply surround ourselves by the four walls of our catheterization laboratories, and we have a responsibility to work on the pipeline, to broaden the representation within our interventional colleagues. And we have a responsibility to work with our institutions to make sure that all segments of our society have access to these amazing technologies like TAVR.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cigarroa. Another article coming from CCI highlighting again the TAVR technology from Dr. Cigarroa.
Certainly. The next article that I'd like to highlight is by Giorgio Madranda. And this manuscript was entitled Prosthetic Valve Endocarditis After Transcatheter Valve Replacement in Low-Risk Patients. And I think this is a really important issue, and especially as we're talking about young patients undergoing transcatheter techniques, what is that risk, so that we can have those discussions relative to the alternative approach, which is SAVR. And this manuscript demonstrated that in patients who were classified as low risk, approximately 400, of which approximately a quarter had bicuspid valves, that prosthetic valve endocarditis occurred in an overall low frequency by 1 year, approximately 2.8%. And the most common bacteria was Streptococcus. When the endocarditis occurred early, which was in 5 of the patients, 3 of these presented with embolic strokes, and 2 of them underwent surgical aortic valve reintervention. Late prosthetic valve endocarditis occurred in 6 patients, and this was defined after 1 year, of which half of them, or 3 patients, again presented with embolic strokes. And so, although uncommon, the occurrence, especially when one presents with findings of neurologic or peripheral emboli, one really should think about endocarditis. And, these rates are exceedingly low, less than 3%. And so if one looks at the historical controls from the surgical literature, the rate is not higher. And I think that's an important point.
Yeah, so I think, again, this is very interesting data, and it's very reassuring to know that as we move to a lower risk population, that the endocarditis rate is not higher than that in a surgical population. Obviously, any embolic stroke is or potentially can be devastating for the individual themselves. So I think it's something that we'd be keen to look and see, are there any particular predictors or any particular factors that might mitigate the endocarditis risk. But certainly it's reassuring data as we move towards the lower risk population.
And I think this is consistent with data that has been published in intermediate and high-risk groups out of the TVT registry as well. And there have been additional manuscripts that have been published in the literature on the management of endocarditis and the possibility of treating with antibiotics, for a prolonged period, and not necessarily having to explant, the valve. And so, I think we could do a whole session on just that in the future.
Yep. Well, thank you, Dr. Cigarroa. I think that's it, right? Can I close?
I think we certainly remain incredibly excited about the field and the amount of research that is coming out in patients with aortic stenosis treated with TAVR. And, CCI has a whole component of the journal that focuses on structural interventions. And I'd like to call out 2 articles that would be published soon. One is by Gilbert Tang, entitled Outcomes and Feasibility of Redo TAVR After the SAPIEN 3 Ultra TAVR in Extremely Either Undersized versus Nominally Sized Annuli. And that manuscript will be published soon. And the second is a manuscript by Ron Waxman and colleagues that provides an overview of the recent FDA Circulatory Systems Devices panel meeting on the TriGuard 3 cerebral embolic protection, which provides interesting insights into the regulatory environment and the risk and safety profiles for how FDA approaches assessing new devices relative to efficacy, safety, and risk benefit. So we're looking forward to those two manuscripts.
Very exciting times, Dr. Cigarroa. On behalf of the social media editorial board team, I would like to thank you for the thoughtful comments on the 20th anniversary for TAVR technology.
Thank you to each of you, and have a wonderful day.